The next session is about investor perspective. How do trustees, chief executives and chief investment officers approach active ownership? And what role do super funds play as active owners and stewards, and what challenges do they face? We've got just the people to tell us. Our panellists today for the investor perspective are Deanne Stewart. She joined Aware Super as Chief Executive Officer in 2018. She has more than 25 years leadership experience in financial services, in wealth, superannuation and insurance in Australia and internationally. This includes time as Managing Director with Merrill Lynch Investment Management in New York and as Engagement Manager with McKinsey & Co in London. Ian Patrick is CIO of the Australian Retirement Trust. He's responsible for leading the investment teams which design and implement Australian Retirement Trust's investment strategies, all the while maintaining a strong emphasis on governance. He joined Sun Super in 2015 and has more than 25 years' experience in the institutional investment industry. And Councillor Linda Scott was appointed Chair of Care Super in April 2022 after joining the fund in 2018. Linda also became a Director of AXI in 2022. She was the first female Chair of Local Government New South Wales and is currently serving as President of the Australian Local Government Association. Linda's also a City of Sydney councillor and formerly served as Deputy Lord Mayor. Moderating this session is Ed John, Executive Manager of Stewardship at AXI. Please welcome our panel.
Well, thanks everyone, and I appreciate we're the last session before afternoon tea, so we'll keep the energy up, and the donuts will await after we speak. Now, this morning I think we've talked a lot about and got an insider view from what's happening within listed companies and some of Australia's largest boardrooms, but really this afternoon we step across the fence and find out a lot more about how investors are working through some of these issues. I think it strikes me that one thing theme through the day is certainly that as the size and sophistication of investment programs grow, so too do the ESG and sustainability challenges that we're tackling. And as we sit here in a industry which is now $3.4 trillion and tackling some of these huge issues both across the Australian economy and global markets, that they're really relevant themes. So we have three leading funds here and people sitting in three different parts as CEO, CIO and Chair. So really to start to unpack that, I might begin with you, Deanne, about as CEO of one of Australia's largest funds, how you get a lens on some of these issues we've been discussing.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And it's fabulous to be here, and I've enjoyed the session so much today. So I think some of the things that I've heard this morning is definitely some of the approach that we then take as a super fund. But I think first and foremost, you've got to look at it from the highest level when you're thinking about superannuation. And ultimately, the purpose of superannuation and the purpose of a super fund is to really maximise the retirement savings of our members. And it's the retirement savings. And so that lens of it, whether it's a member retiring tomorrow or indeed a member retiring in a long term, that's what really drives that sustainable nature and the importance of responsible ownership. And certainly my daughter reminded me of this most recently. My daughter is 16 years of age, has just got her first part-time job, and the superannuation package arrived in the mail, and she opened up and she goes, apart from saying, why do I have 10% of my salary taken out, and talking her through that, she was like, but Mum, I'm not retiring until, the 2070s? So how do you make sure you take care? And it just, that puts it in perspective. We're talking about net zero by 2050, but some of our members joining today, it's 2070 is their retirement. And so then when we think about responsible investing, we actually think, well, to that, how do you really enhance the returns, protect our members, but also the positive impact that we have as an opportunity for our members into their future and what they're retiring into. And so we think about both the ESG integration and how to really think about the material ESG risks, the data. You've heard a lot of that this morning, so I won't repeat that. But certainly we look at that as the most material ESG risks, but think about that sector by sector, and then within that, what companies and assets hold the highest risk, and that's where we spend most of our time and attention to make sure we can enhance those returns and protect the downside. But then that moves into our second plank, which is really about the stewardship. So if we've got all that data and we're wanting to enhance returns, how do we use our stewardship through advocacy, engagement, and the policy and proxy voting to actually really shift the dial? And so that's the second plank. And then the third, which is becoming an increasing element, particularly as a large super fund, is the ownership. So in the assets that we own, how are we being a responsible owner and enhancing value through the assets that we own? And that's where we're turning a lot of our time and attention now.
Thanks, Deanne. And maybe, Ian, if I could bring you in from an ART perspective. You know, a lot of issues to unpack, but...
So I'm struck in listening to that introduction that in ART's context, it became very short-term because of the merger. And it became very focused on how do we take two legacy positions, reconcile them, but not only reconcile them, build the position for the identity of ART, or Australian Retirement Trust, going forward. And that comes with both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages clearly are that you're starting with somewhat of a blank sheet, although you're never starting with a true blank sheet. And you can really examine the positions of both historic entities, what worked, what didn't, take lessons from those, be thoughtful about the future intent in framing policy, because you are creating brand new, and the objective of the board was to have, at day one, on the 28th of February when the merger kicked off, have a brand new sustainable investment policy for ART that set ART's long-term objectives, not those of the historic organisation. So that's the opportunity. The challenge is, when you do have a blank sheet, you have a plethora of issues in front of you, and the discipline to determine thoughtfully what your strategy will be and how you will prioritise those actions going forward, I think is actually quite challenging, because everybody wants to have a view, everybody's engaged at that particular point. You're not just turning over what you did last year, to be a bit crass about it. Everybody's engaged, and so maintaining a discipline is tricky. I find myself in the fortunate position of being able to leverage resources. Two funds doing two streams of work, carbon baselining, whatever it happens to be. You can now combine those resources and focus on one problem for one. Not straightforward, because the two approaches were historically different, but you've got one mission, and I think that's critically important. You suddenly get an effective scale, for want of a better term, up front. Now, I started by saying it becomes short-term. It's all focused on how do we get ourselves set to cross the start line. Clearly, the focus is on delivering long-term sustainability. To the earlier point, our social purpose is delivering a sustainable retirement income. And if we get behind that fundamental purpose, the rest follows.
No, that's really useful, Ian, and really interested to bring you in here, Linda, both as from Care Super's perspective, but also a trustee chair perspective on these key issues.
Well, obviously, trustees, have all the responsibility and this enormous legal weight and obligation that we have to grapple with every time we sit around a board table, and indeed all those other times when we're not at the board table as well. And so, of course, members' best financial interest is at the forefront of everything we do, and all those obligations. I trained as a psychologist, and it's, I think, very important to take that high view as a board director, or, in my role, of course, as chair of Care Super. But there is a risk that if you continue to take such a high view and don't think about the people involved, then that can become a problem for your thinking. So in my role as chair, often I will speak to open a board meeting about a particular member. And in thinking about ESG challenges, I think it is useful to imagine the impact as a trustee of the woman working in the Bangladeshi factory at the end of a modern slavery supply chain, or the Pacifica man watching his family's cemetery wash away into the ocean. I think that conceptualising these things in line with our obligations, but about the impact on the individual, is a significant thing for trustees and boards to do. At Care Super, we integrate ESG at every level. So we have our ESG experts working as part of our investments team. They're not in separate teams. The reports and information that comes from the executive to our board, it's not a separate report. There's not an ESG lens. It just is totally integrated into the way that we think about these things, because of course we see that our trustee obligations to invest and support the retirement prosperity of our members over the long term is absolutely dependent on ESG information being considered throughout that process. So our view at Care Super is that our obligations are aligned with our ESG obligations, and over the long term they have to be completely integrated.
That's really useful, Linda. And I think that perspective of the individual and how people impact the organisation is really important. And we heard earlier of ANZ's experience trying to put yourself in the shoes. Again, one of the challenges of scale, and perhaps I go to you on this, Deanne, when you have more than 1 million members, trying to put yourself in the shoes of such a large group or understand the views on ESG issues must be difficult. So how do you door knock one by one across the group?
Clearly not, but I think it is really important to take that pulse check and be constantly reviewing it. So certainly from our perspective, and you heard some of the examples this morning earlier, whether it be customer complaints or compliments at times, that's certainly a huge area. We have online member live feedback. So I've got it on my phone and I check it on my phone just about every day. What are our members saying? And you actually see a significant number of those compliments or complaints are actually ESG related. So we've sort of got our finger on our pulse from that perspective, and that really helps. But the other aspect that I would also say is it is important also to engage with members and associations on elements. So we do a lot of those sort of live meetings with some of our associations to get a good pulse check of what is really important to the member base as well, and that really assists it as well.
Yeah, if I could just take that a little bit further, what sort of things do you hear? Here's a good example. At our last annual member meeting, we had 80 questions come through, and now I don't know whether that's high or low compared to other funds in terms of the questions that came in, but 60 of those questions were around fossil fuels, oil and gas, and what are we doing? And so that just gives you a sense of, out of the 80 questions, 60 of them being around that area. And particularly if you think about our member base, we've got a lot of nurses, teachers, doctors, police, fireys. They are on the front line. They absolutely see what's happening in the environment, what's happening with climate change. And so that feedback loop constantly to us absolutely does help us drive in terms of our thoughts of how we actually best position our fund for our members. And Ian, perhaps with the ART, I know it's a relatively blank sheet of paper, but are you getting that feedback? And if so, what's it saying?
I'll just build on the stats there about questions, because ours isn't dissimilar in terms of the proportion of the pre-submitted questions that touch on climate and, let's call it, exclusion and fossil fuels. But my most sobering experience is the first run we had at the annual member meeting. Pre-submitted questions, lots on fossil fuels. We were fortunate to be able to run that annual member meeting live, looked out at the audience, probably average age is 60. Because of the pre-submitted questions, we prepared really hard on what we were going to say about climate. And you could see it was visible, people rolling their eyes and going, come on, just get on with giving me my returns. And that was quite a sobering experience for me in terms of the engaged member. And clearly the audience is engaged, but the engaged member who's prepared to put in those questions is not necessarily representative of the broad church. Now, that doesn't mean we should that we should change our approach, but it does talk to me about the way we have to communicate. We have to be very clear about what we're setting out to do, the data that backs up what we're setting out to do, and consistently reinforce that, because I think that's the key for members and for our credibility in terms of, let's call it, a social licence through time.
I was going to sort of move a little bit sideways, but actually occurred to me, Linda, both at Care Super as well as in your day job, that stakeholder engagement sort of a key part. I mean, as a relatively new entrant into the super sector, how you see Care meeting those challenges and also evolving that approach?
It's important in any organisation, isn't it, to understand what your members are concerned about and to ensure that you're meeting their obligations about financial best interests, but also listening and responding to their interests and concerns. And I dare say that, like these two funds, the members of Care Super do have very strong views about a range of issues, including action on climate change. Yes, in my other life, my job is to look after the nation's 537 local governments, and as you can imagine, the mayors come from every different component of Australia's political spectrum and have a very strong diversity of views about absolutely every policy issue you can imagine. So I'm not unfamiliar with needing to work with disparate groups to try to find the commonalities and align them. But climate is the issue that continues to still in Australia be extremely divisive. I was in Parliament only yesterday watching the new federal government, of course, table their new bill with Australian targets for the first time. I think that will be an interesting shift for Australians and also for superannuation funds. We, like so many other organisations in Australia, in the absence of national targets, and Care Super has set our own targets for net zero by 2050, we have all set about setting targets. But now we will have a national target with a government that is about to proceed to setting sectoral targets and working on implementation plans. And it's going to be a pretty significant shift for us all to perhaps work towards our own targets that many of us in this room have set at the board level, but also understand now how we best integrate with those national efforts. And I think that's a pivot people have realised they need to make this week in the face of a new national bill, and looking to those efforts for, of course, international neighbours that have already had national targets, but also finding ways that we can share innovations in individual places or in individual investment classes or within individual funds to just really lift all of us, I think will be a really important thing to do.
That's really useful, and for me it triggers that challenge we heard from Mark Carney this morning on net zero alignment and sophistication in the organisations, and might be a good place to go. And Deanne, maybe if I bring you in here, setting a net zero target and meeting that challenge, how have you set on that path, and where do you think you're going?
Yeah, this has certainly been a huge amount of work, and I certainly have to credit Lisa, who's here in the audience, and her team for doing a huge amount of the work to both set that target, net zero, and I certainly think the politics of it now are certainly helping that be much more conducive. But I think where we need to evolve, and certainly what we've done with our transition plan, is go so well beyond that. Certainly you heard from some of the speakers this morning, there's an urgency to that as well. So something out at 2050, setting a target, step one. What we've then done is actually said, okay, well, according to Paris Agreement, what needs to happen in an economy-wide, global-wide, and then in a portfolio-wide, what do we need to get done by 2030? Okay, what do we need to get done by 2030? Okay, then let's come even closer. What do we need to do over the next 3 years? So we've both set targets at a long-term, a medium-term, and a short-term. And then from that, okay, what's the action plan? How do we baseline all of our equity portfolio? That's an easier thing to do, except for Scope 3, as we all know. And what are we needing to do in the way that we engage, the way we construct the portfolio that's going to enhance value in the short, but more importantly, the medium and long term? So we've gone about that. Now what we're actually doing is we've just completed baselining all of our private assets. Now that was much harder to do, as you can imagine, but we've struck about doing that because our view is you can't just do it on the listed side. Ultimately, to get below 2 degrees, it can't just be about big corporate, big publicly listed companies. Actually, it's the whole system wide. And this is the role that all of us have to play as institutional investors, is really moving the whole system along, not just 1 or 2 companies. And that's the job to be done, I think, at an industry-wide level.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of fund managers in the room today, some private asset and infrastructure managers. Are they there yet in terms of what you need?
Certainly on the private side, not so. But there's, like all things, a bell curve. You definitely see some organisations well ahead in terms of their thinking. But that degree of transparency and really ask of what is disclosed, etc., is not there so much in the private markets. And so certainly our view is let's at least do that across our portfolio and drive our assets in that way. But I bring that up because I think at an industry level, this is what we need to do to really lift the bar to where we need to be.
No, definitely. And picking up the financial review this morning, there was quite a bit of coverage on NAB's new report with Deloitte on the energy transition and some of the numbers. I mean, there were $1 trillion figures, but the $420 billion in climate transition. Sitting with some very large funds here that will get larger. It feels like a opportunity for an episode of Perfect Match there. But when you think about that bucket and that investment trend, Ian, perhaps as a CIO, the opportunities there, we're often focused on the risk of ESG, but actually the opportunities for new investment, when you look at those sorts of numbers and the necessary investments for the transition, what do you see?
How long have you got? No. More seriously, I think this is one of the most complex tasks for an investment team right now. And that's because whether it's well evolved or partially evolved, consideration of all ESG risks, including climate risks, are well framed in a risk context, as you point out, but in an opportunity context, and understanding the nature of the technologies, how those may evolve in response to the emerging practice for carbon abatement and the like. That's an incredibly tough task, and I'm not sure if you adopt the mindset that you're going to need the best minds in the world and therefore you're going to be tapping largely external expertise for it. I'm not sure the pool of expertise is even that deep. And I don't want to offend anybody in the room, and our capacity to select managers is reasonably well evolved for their financial skill. I don't know that we've got all the skills yet to identify the best practitioners in what are new spaces. So I completely understand and embrace the potential for opportunity, but I am scared by the ability of asset owners to execute well. And I think it's an area, and this is a personal view, I think it's an area for enhanced collaboration amongst asset owners, because deploying that capital well and ensuring it is aligned to the overall objectives of transition, I think will require each of us to play a cohesive part in that whole.
Thanks, Ian. And I think you've breached the rule of ESG conferences. We can't acknowledge what we don't do well. No, actually, it's probably the opposite with AXI and our members. We're always looking to innovate and challenge and perhaps to bring in the other panel members there. We've reflected on how far we've come on some of these issues like climate, like some of the social factors, but where you see the opportunities to innovate. I mean, Linda, as a fresh set of eyes, where do you think those opportunities to improve are?
Yeah, this is my favourite part. I'm so excited by the opportunities for the future. Like Deanne, I talk to my children about this. My sons are 11 and 10. My 11-year-old learnt to program robots when he was 5, and he's got very advanced plans for designing flying transportation systems. As I sit in my local government meetings talking about road funding, I do sometimes think this is all totally irrelevant. So I think there's just enormous opportunities for innovation of our assets and how we do these things differently for the future that are going to really benefit superannuation funds and how we can invest our members' retirements. I'm here as a board chair, but I guess just again, coming back to my other role in local government as a representative of a massive asset owner, there's so many great local things that you can do. In my council, we were quite worried about recycling rates. We couldn't find places to best create a circular economy, so we got all the Sydney Metropolitan Councils together. We took all the glass that we were collecting in people's bins. We found a provider deliberately in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, where of course there's a huge transition from coal mining to new industries to support the workforce transition happening there. And we're working to create a factory that will process all the local government glass and will buy it back and use it for bike path, footpath and road base. So we just work to create our own internal circular economy. We didn't use superannuation funding to do that, but it certainly would have benefited and fast-tracked the process. And people are really clever at the asset owner level. You're all thinking about how to do this, in part because it saves you money. Again, we have converted most of our lighting assets to LED lighting. Of course, it's good for the environment, but it also saves a stack of money. So, you know, there I think are absolutely enormous opportunities here in the ESG space, particularly in the innovation space around the need to reduce emissions for superannuation funds to invest in for the future.
No, thanks, Linda. And Deanne, I mean, it seems like you've got some pretty good answers for the 60 out of 80 members who will ask questions now, but as you look forward, you know, where some of those gaps lie and opportunities for us?
Yeah, in terms of the gaps, and then I will come on to the opportunities because I think that's far more exciting to talk about the opportunities, but in terms of the gaps or the way from here, I think if I just pick up on one of your points, Ian, I think once again, if I go back to what are we trying to do? We're trying to allow all Australians to have a better retirement. So I think at a systems level, actually where we need to take, and we just heard it in the previous session, how do we, at a systems level, collaborate and create better standards and better measurements so that we actually can have that baseline? So I think really rallying behind that as a first case is really important, and that previous session was really important because we can't be coming at this all in completely different directions. A, that doesn't help systematically, but also B, from a corporate perspective. I often hear from corporates, you're changing the goalposts all the time and we don't know what the goalposts are. So let's get really clear about that, right? So I think that's number one. Number two, though, is we have to move from targets to action, from commitment to action. And we've all got a role in this room to really play in that second element. And then thirdly, as I said, is making sure that we're looking at that right across our portfolios, not just in the listed markets. So that's on the gap side. In terms of the opportunities, you know, they are endless. So I think back to the point of being really disciplined around what are your big investment theses and where do you see opportunities arising there that have a real ESG lens. So for us, for example, on our property side, we have an absolute belief in how there'll be really strong returns in the living segment, we call it. So that's things like build to rent, retirement villages, etc. Okay, with that lens, what can we do from an ESG perspective, both to have a really positive impact on the communities where our members work, live and retire, but also how do we actually enhance value? So an example of that for us is what we've done in the affordable housing space. We really believe in the build to rent, but we've added a segment aimed at essential workers around affordable housing. It's been a very good return for us, but it's also had a really positive impact on the community. So that's an example for us. But then where I think it is a bit more opportunistic, that often has a role in the private equity space. So, for example, over the last week, we've just invested in this I think it's fabulous, this company in WA that basically is like a red kelp derivative that actually really helps livestock reduce methane, as an example. Now, that is actually definitely a more speculative investment, but it's something that we think has real opportunity. So that's why it's probably a smaller investment at first that we could then scale up as we learn more in that space.
It's really exciting to hear those sort of new opportunities coming through in funds portfolios. I'll pause there and look out to the audience. Keen to bring in some questions and have one up the back here.
Thanks very much, Ed. Michael Salvatico from S&P Global. Thank you very much all for the open and transparent discussion. My question is on ISSB and biodiversity, two of the big themes of today. And I thought it'd be interesting to get a sense check from you, from CEO, CIO, Chair, about the discussion that's being had on those two topics, like a temperature gauge of where you're at in these discussions, given that they're relatively new to the industry. Thank you.
You'd like to?
I mean, look, again, on a personal note, they're obviously not new to the world, though, are they? My dad was an environmental scientist. I grew up around the dinner table talking about endangered species because, you know, we're just complete nerds. But I think it's also fair to say that recently the new State of the Environment report that's been released by the Commonwealth Government is pretty confronting, and I think it will shock Australians into action in a way that perhaps we haven't seen for some time. It is a very significant thing to consider. Of course, we heard Fiona talk about the importance of land use planning this morning as a critical component of how we take action, and the consideration of biodiversity and the impact of that is going to be so significant to get that balance right. And as you can imagine, coming from a local government background, I'm also just pretty interested in how we figure our way through there. We don't want our communities to be living in unsafe environments, but nor do we want to get rid of all the koalas in Australia because we need to make room for more housing. So I think that this increasingly will, as a result of probably this recent State of the Environment report, be front of mind for more people. But, you know, to your point, it's certainly not new in the world, and these considerations are really critical to how we meet our ESG obligations for the future.
Yeah. So the two topics, the ISSB, I think is incredibly important globally and in Australia. And it's important that we have a lens from an Australian perspective as well. So we are possibly one of the 2,000 organisations that have put our own submission in to ISSB about the standards and where they're heading. And I think it's important that we have an Australian lens to where we want that to head as well, and that there is also a sector lens to that, because it is very different material risks depending on the sector. So I think we're very supportive of that direction, because actually having clear standards, getting the data through actually does enable you to make more informed decisions, but it also has a much bigger impact from a comparability and some of the points that I think Christian raised as well. So that's that. On terms of biodiversity, I certainly think, and I applaud ACSI for the work that they're doing on this as well, it is definitely an emerging ESG area that we've really got to be alive to, and we're very much at that watching, learning, doing research, forming our views on that at the moment from an ESG lens. From an investment lens, it's actually an area that we've been investing in significantly for quite some time. So we've done a lot in the agri side, for example, particularly taking into account sort of climate and biodiversity. So what we've done on that space has actually been really positive in our private equity portfolio, for example. So it's certainly something we've been doing from an investment perspective, but we've got a lot more to go from an ESG and the risk perspective.
That's really useful, and I think, again, all of the funds trying to integrate these factors, if there isn't that comparable disclosure, if the data isn't there, pretty difficult challenge. We'll take more questions in the room, but one has come through on the app, and that's just how important is cooperation among asset owners in the transition to net zero. We heard a lot about that this morning, particularly the role of governments alongside investors. So, Ian, perhaps if I bring you in there, just to talk about that role of collaboration.
Sure, and apologies, I didn't hear the discussion this morning, so I'm coming off a fresh base. I think collaboration is particularly important. I think the pace at which change needs to occur and the limits on resourcing that we have and the importance in terms of authenticity for the voice from investors to be consistent all points to a degree of collaboration. I'd go so far as to say that I don't think in reality we have an alternative. Now, will we always be completely aligned? And will we all, in terms of position, I don't want to pretend that we will always be aligned, but I think fundamentally, because especially amongst superannuation asset owners, the core purpose is very common. I think there'll be enough alignment to collaborate well, and I think the overall interests of what we're aiming to achieve through transition to a net zero world will drive a commonality of interest that will underpin collaboration. So yeah, I'm a big believer.
And perhaps Linda, I mean, you've just come back from Canberra, so very fresh in the mind, but how do you think about that collaboration among investors and then also where government needs to be to assist that?
Look, of course, I agree. Collaboration is really important, and it is going to be, really significant, I think, to chart this way forward. I also think, though, to your point about everybody not necessarily completely agreeing, I see that again as a real strength. Just to go to the shape of the industry for a moment. I mean, Care Super takes the view that it's in the national interest to have a diversity of size of superannuation funds because, in part, it means that people go about things quite differently, and it means that, in part, investment opportunities that perhaps will be of interest to Aware Super may not be beneficial for Care Super and vice versa. So, to the point about the fact that we won't all agree, I think that gives the superannuation industry the ability to make Australia's national interest stronger, and it means that for us as asset owners or external asset owners, there's going to be an interest in investing because of the different shape of the industry that's really beneficial. The other thing, and it's a bit to the side of the question, but just sort of out of interest, I did want to mention there is this sort of concern, I think, to some extent that I hear often that investing in ESG organisations, or that it can sort of be a draw on performance, and I just think it's useful when you look at the evidence. So it is a bit of coincidence, but at Care Super this year, our balanced option overperformed in exactly the same measure as our sustainable balanced option. And I think as, again, we look forward, there are so many opportunities for innovative investing that we're going to really see that diversity of investment that we have been doing through ESG investment, and then perhaps, outside of our sustainable balance options as offering strength, especially in volatile markets. I think that's just an important thing to remember.
No, definitely. I should apologise to the people on the right side of the room. I can't actually see you, so if there are arms up, you have to wave them quickly. But Deanne, I think we did want to touch on, because you talked about a couple of those opportunities you're pursuing, and I think we've talked about the investor collaboration side, but again, the role of government, I mean, you talk about that 2070 timeline of your daughter, but some of those policy settings which could actually assist, what sticks out for you there?
Certainly, and I thought that was a really good discussion this morning, I have to say, and I think certainly some of the things that Fiona was bringing up I think are really important, because there is no doubt that you need asset owners, investors, corporate, community and government to get this mammoth task done, right? So, but I think it isn't just about setting the net zero. I think that's so important that everyone rallies behind that and allows that to move forward. But it is other elements. So, for example, exactly what are we doing around EV and that side? What does it mean for the building and materials? What does it mean from an overall natural capital? So there's so many elements that you want to sort of review from an overall policy perspective that I think climate is definitely the big mammoth one, but there are other elements underneath it.
It strikes me also that so many of these issues, and the directors earlier were talking about those long-term challenges, and again, perhaps switching off climate policy, but to more, capital S super policy. The performance test, a lot written about it, a lot spoken about it, and whether or not that actually helps or hinders long-term thinking, and perhaps I'll again put you on the hot seat as CIO, Ian, but that challenge of dealing with a performance test that maybe doesn't support active risk or long-term thinking.
How many rules of conferences do you want me to break?
All of them. No.
So my view on this is that the performance test clearly defines the opportunity set. I think it's very hard to dispute that because the government or the regulator is setting out what your opportunity set looks like by definition. In addition, the existential threat that comes from failing the performance test creates a constraint in your investment strategy setting that I think is indisputable. By definition, to me, that is cumbersome, if not harmful, and that's where I'm straying close to the line. It's cumbersome to reconcile with the job ahead of us in terms of climate transition and broader social transformation that accompanies climate transition as well as broader social transition. And that worries me from the point of view of success because it is a handbrake. Now, having said all of that, our job is to take active risk. We know what the bogey is, the benchmark. If we believe active risk will be rewarded, and I think active risk by participating in a transition to a low carbon economy and broader social impact, I think that active risk will be rewarded. Maybe not over an 8-year time frame, but it will be rewarded. That's our job. We have to be bold, we have to take on the active risk, and that's fundamentally the approach we're taking today. But to just say that and ignore the constraint would be inappropriate, I feel.
No, and Deanne, has it changed the thinking in your fund?
I certainly think what Ian has just said, I would absolutely mirror. I think ultimately the job there is to, with the performance test, it focuses the mind on high conviction, quite frankly. So when taking that active risk, you need to have high conviction. So that is certainly an element. I certainly think from a sustainability perspective, it is more problematic from that perspective in terms of the shorter term lens versus the longer term lens for sustainability. So that I think is problematic. And then if you look at some of the underlying indexes, they are backward looking. So you just take the, as we all know, the infrastructure index or the property index, what's in that is not necessarily what you'll invest into the future. So by that very nature, you are taking active risk. And so for us, we will continue to do so. It very much focuses the mind, though, on where there is high conviction.
Absolutely. And perhaps just as I digest that, Ian, you've talked about sort of breaching the rule there or sort of challenging one aspect of it. Perhaps to take it a step further, how would you suggest sort of changing or updating the approach so you can still take a long-term view but without that sort of secondary byproduct or challenge that you hit with in terms of the underperformance?
And this is where I'm perpetually challenged, because it's one thing to point out the problems. It's quite another to come up with an effective, reasonably frictionless answer. And the reason I say that is think of the recent announcements about faith-based options. So you've got to declare that you won in advance, you've got to go through the performance test, and then you've got to have a subsequent assessment. Now, if we try and build a similar framework to cater to the broader investment transformation that will occur by virtue of addressing climate, I don't know that that's efficient and frictionless, or even near frictionless. And that's where I struggle to come up with a solution. But with improvements in measurement, we are seeing alternative indices that could well be used in the performance test environment. Now, they may be unfamiliar and therefore harder for regulators to adopt, but I think there is work we can do as an industry with regulators around the emergence of those additional indices and additional ways of thinking, and maybe there's a carve-out. I don't like carve-outs in principle, but maybe there's a carve-out for specific investments.
No, that's useful. We're in our last minute. We've just had a question come through on the app from Mike Harut, so as a former AXI person, I need to ask it. I'm obliged. I'll give this to you, Linda, because we spoke a lot about this in the preparation for the conference. And again, in the last 30 seconds, investment, divestment on the transition to net zero. What happens if we divest and just some of these assets just end up in private hands? Where do you sit on that invest, divest?
So clearly, Care Super takes the active engagement and invest approach, and proud to be members of AXI, of course, to support the combined efforts. It is different though in different sectors. In local government, there's been a huge divestment movement. Of course, the assets are significantly different, but I just do think it is important to acknowledge that there's different cultures in different sectors, and to turn that around, is a very significant thing. Care Super, superannuation, definitely engagement. We don't just want to be shifting the risk and liability and poor outcomes to somebody else's balance sheet.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks to all of our panellists who have just hit time. So I really appreciate those views, and we'll join me in thanking them, and we'll break from afternoon tea. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.